Hello again to all of my third and fifth period AP US history students. Since I recorded my first lecture, things have moved on a little, and we got the big notice from College Board that they will be cutting out all of the last two units of the course. And so, whilst this whole thing is obviously deeply unfortunate, we are in good shape. We are obviously moving towards the end of wrapping up the New Deal here in the Great Depression. That will just leave us with World War II. So I think we've worked hard this year. We've made great progress. You've shown, both classes have shown great progress in terms of essay writing. And so I feel like we're now in a position of relative strength heading into the final stretch. It's a strange road for us, but yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about it. I don't want to overload you guys at work. In terms of remote teaching, that has been it's difficult to figure out. I feel that some teachers might have gone overboard with the amount of work they've sent this week, just a personal opinion. Other teachers, they're trying to take it a little bit easier. I'm going to follow that model. I'm going to try to ramp it up over the next few weeks. We're going to do more work, but I'm not going to go too hard. I know that home life is not easy these days. You're sharing space with other people. It is not the ideal place for learning for some people. So I'm going to be steady as she goes, sort of style, really. Anyway, FDR and the New Deal. So today, what I want to do is to focus on opposition to FDR and the New Deal and to troubles that he ran into. Um, so let's start with that. I'm going to bring this on now here. We're going to move out to this. Yes, let's start here. So we have here the backdrop to this is 1936. FDR went back to the people. There had been a reduction in unemployment, relief works programs set up around the country, and other private-public partnerships. And the people decided to return FDR to office with a massive surplus. And the Democrats had a very large majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so it looked like things were going very well for him. But he does run into problems. Now, let me first of all say that Congress was largely on board even from the early days of FDR's tenure. And in this sense, too, we have to look at the Great Depression. Although a terrible thing, it also provided an opportunity for societal change. It prized open a window of time in which a whole tranche of people who didn't usually suffer did suffer. And in that, they deepened their empathy and, in a sense, threw in their lot with the poor underclass who had always suffered. And because of that, there was a wider sample's not the right word, a much wider section of society that was open to change. And this was reflected in Congress, in the ability to support a bipartisanship supporting the president's will. I think there are really interesting parallels here between the New Deal and the times we're living at the moment. Just as I record this lecture this morning, breaking news is that a $2 trillion stimulus recovery bill has been reached between the Democrats and Republicans, and that President Trump is expected to sign off on this. This is an example here of collaboration in a time of desperation. So I think there's a really interesting parallel there. Anyway, so we have the House and the Senate on board. Of course, there is opposition, but he does have clear majorities. However, FDR does face significant opposition from the Supreme Court. Not only is it opposition, it is successful opposition, striking down several of FDR's major legislative initiatives. Now, in this, they played the role of a very conservative force looking to truly limit the power of the executive office. We've seen this before, though, this idea of the Supreme Court playing a reactionary view, a limiting view in American history. They struck down the Keating-Owens Child Welfare Bill, Child Labor Act, during the era of Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt was also very frustrated by the efforts of the Supreme Court to uphold the interests of the elite and wealthy corporate powers, the idea of corporate personhood. We also have Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling in favor of segregation. Now, you know by my tone here, I have a bias. This is well known to many of you, um, in that I am an admirer of FDR, and I certainly would be a critic of these conservative forces within the Supreme Court. However, I also have to admit here that in this space of time, such a rapid acceleration in the powers of federal government was a scary thing. And therefore, the Supreme Court did have respect, was seen as an important factor in limiting the power of government. So let's get into some details on this now. So what in particular, what major New Deal programs were struck down by the Supreme Court and on what grounds? Well, it was a range um, of acts, not just the two here on the slideshow in front of you. A minimum wage act was struck down, but the two biggest ones were the striking down of the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The National Recovery Administration was probably the most radical, far-reaching program that FDR dreamt up. And essentially, it suspended some of the reforms of the progressives. It suspended the idea of trust. It allowed for monopolies in a time of the emergency of the New Deal. And the idea being that in return for allowing these monopolies, that the corporations would agree to encourage and not inhibit the unionization of their workers, that they would agree to fix prices for the idea of stabilizing the economy. Now, the Supreme Court struck down the National Recovery Act and Administration on the grounds that the Congress had unconstitutionally delegated powers to the presidency. You don't need to worry about those details too much, just to know that they did stand in his way. The Agricultural Adjustment Act had already been one of the most controversial aspects of FDR's presidency. He basically, the AAA had gotten farmers to destroy crops and livestock in an effort, a successful effort, to raise prices for farmers, to bring relief to farmers. But again, this had been struck down by the Supreme Court as an overreach of the federal government. So this greatly frustrated FDR, but it also greatly frustrated a lot of people. The four most conservative members of the Supreme Court were commonly referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. There was books brought out. Attacks on the Supreme Court were quite common. People saw them as inhibiting the will of the people, of upholding the interests of an elite, of being stuck in time. And so the scene was set for a battle. So what did FDR do? Well, FDR did something quite radical. And this is probably one of the things FDR has been most criticized for. He basically stated that for every Supreme Court justice over the age of 70 that did not retire, that he would make a new Supreme Court justice. And what is interesting here is that the Supreme Court is not constitutionally limited to 9 justices. You can make as many as you like. But traditionally, the number had been maintained at this level. So when FDR floated this idea, it really divided people. And this battle raged in the media for many months. But two things happened which actually led FDR to suffer a defeat. Firstly, uh, the Supreme Court softened their position and actually ruled in favor of a number of upcoming major pieces of New Deal legislation, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. So this softened the public's view of the Supreme Court and weakened FDR's case. And then what happened too was that there was dissent from within the Democratic Party. Significant minority opposed his plan to pack the court packing plan, and therefore he backed down, and the Supreme Court remained at its level of 9 justices. And this has been seen as an example of FDR overreaching. It has been seen as FDR, a defeat for FDR. However, and you might see this is predictable considering my sentiment for FDR. However, I actually have a different take on this. I see this as an actual long-term victory for FDR because it allowed him to secure passage of major pieces of socially transformative legislation. So what were those pieces of legislation? Here we go. So, well, actually, I should go back to that. I was here all along. I'm sorry. Yes. So, two major pieces. Parish versus West Coast. You can see it here on the right-hand side. We have a maid dressing a bed. This was the Supreme Court reversing its decision, a couple of key justices changing side and upholding, for the first time, upholding a federal minimum wage act. So this was a real boon for ordinary workers, and I think it is firm evidence of the fact that the court packing scheme, whilst unsuccessful, actually brought long-term benefits and secured major pieces of legislation. None bigger were the Wagner Act. This is a very significant piece. It marks the beginning of a golden period for labor unions in America. A period of labor unions that lasted from the mid-1930s through to the 50s, you could even say into the 70s, a golden period of labor unions, which aligns with the period known as the Great Compression. The Great Compression is a period in American history when the gap between the wealthier elites and the ordinary workers significantly was reduced. Unfortunately, from my perspective, and from the perspective of many people, the gap has significantly widened since the 1980s onwards again, which is also in decline with labor unions and, of course, with the reduction in taxes on the wealthy. But anyway, the Wagner Act, what did it do? The Wagner Act essentially protected the right of private and public sector workers to organize. And so this leads to a golden period for unions. It protects them. It encourages unions to organize. It upholds the right of labor unions once established if there is a majority of the workers who want a union, and that it compelled employers, companies, all companies, to recognize labor unions and to discuss with them, and therefore to enshrine the right of collective bargaining. That is, when labor unions will sit down with companies to discuss the wages of their workers. So a very significant victory indeed. Of course, those times are now over for labor unions. Labor unions now, only 7% of private sector workers in 2020 are unionized. They still do better in the public sector. So moving on to other examples of opposition, let's look at opposition from conservatives more generally to the New Deal. And what criticisms did they make? And we have to say too, some of these criticisms do have some merit. There is this fear, of course. We see it here on the left. Let's bring up the pictures at bigger size. On the left here, this fear that New Deal spending will be out of control. What are the brakes on this thing? We see the figure of FDR saying on the left. FDR himself was conscious of this, and in 1936-37, after he first got back into office, he did actually reduce spending, leading to something called the Roosevelt recession, and then he had to increase spending again. So that was a criticism. We do know, however, that the private-public partnerships, such as the Federal Housing Authority, actually did end up making money. Another criticism was that it was all too experimental, and here we have on the right the picture of FDR as a sort of wacky snake oil salesman doctor, prescribing all these remedies, alphabet soup, all these bottles, and that basically would just keep doling it out. And it certainly is the case that FDR was pragmatic and did try all sorts of things, and not all of these were equally successful. Some were less successful. So that there is some validity in that criticism. Let's move on now. We can also say, though, as well, that not only was he criticized by the right, he was criticized by left-wing activists, specifically for his support of the banks. And this has echoes of our time as well. In 2007, 2008, during the Great Recession, we had a lot of people, still a lot of bitterness amongst many people, both ordinary folk across America today who would consider themselves both conservatives and democratic socialist liberals, very sore about the money that was used to bail out the banks in 2007 and 2008, as was the case in the 1930s. People didn't understand why this was necessary. They criticized it. The great critic of FDR from the left was Huey Long, Senator Huey Long, known as the Kingfisher from Louisiana. What's really interesting about this, here is a guy who really, for all intents and purposes, was a radical socialist. Wouldn't go as far as to call him a communist, but radical socialist. The guy was making FDR look conservative, looking for a soak the rich tax. Now, FDR did increase taxes on the wealthy significantly. But we're talking about radical suggestions of sharing of wealth, a cap on the amount that any individual can own. What's interesting here is that Huey Long had support from rural areas, which again goes against our notion that rural areas are always more conservative. He had a real folksy style, but unfortunately associated with this was a sort of a very unpleasant anti-Semitism hung around this, and of course tapping into the international feel of the time, and getting into the darker waters of anti-Semitism and fascism, and of course Nazism. So that is quite disturbing. Huey Long was vague on these issues. Huey Long's career was cut abruptly short. He was going to contest FDR in the Democratic election, the general election of 36 as an independent, but he was assassinated. Huey Long, the Kingfisher, assassinated. So that is a fascinating part to this story. Now, another way of looking at this here is that if you're being attacked by both the left and the right, perhaps you're getting something right here. And of course, this will be my view. You're entitled to your own view. You always know I'm very happy to have contrasting views. As long as we can support our views, that's the main thing. We have here in this cartoon a picture of FDR. Here he is at the helm. He is guiding the ship to safer shores. The American people are with him while detractors are in the background. And he's leaving the Depression, the storm behind him. Of course, this is a very rosy view of the Depression. It is an exaggerated, overly sympathetic view. But it is clearly one that the American people bought. Remember, this is a man who was returned very comfortably 4 times to the office of presidency. So clearly this is a view that was shared to some degree by the majority of the American people. Now, in our last lecture on the New Deal, which I will post next week, we will discuss some other more transformative elements of the New Deal, that things that stuck around for the long term, such as the Social Security Act. We'll also discuss more on how he interacted with the issues of women's rights, women in office, African Americans, and Native Americans. That will finish off our lecture on the New Deal. Thank you. Oh, finally, please watch out for more questions in our classroom as well associated with this lecture.